How did women's MMA go from headlining pay-per-views, selling out big-time arenas, and breaking records to where they are at today when it is announced that a women's fight will be held on a pay-per-view or a main card? You can hear the outstanding number of eye rolls going around in the MMA fan base. What is going on with women's MMA, and how did it get this bad? To start from the very beginning, back in 2011 when Dana White was infamously asked on TMZ Sports if women will be allowed to fight in the UFC, to which this was his reply.
When are we going to see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Never?
Never.
And just 2 years later, in 2013, the first women's fight was announced to headline UFC 157 as an undefeated rising star and Strikeforce world champion in Ronda Rousey.
Kaufman's lone loss came via, and it's over! Ronda Rousey continues to amaze me! Are you kidding me? 6 pro bouts, 6 first-round armbars. I have never seen anything like it.
She was set to take on Liz Carmouche, who was much more experienced with a record of 8-2. A monumental moment for women's MMA, as this was the very first women's fight in UFC history, as well as being the very first fight to headline on a pay-per-view. And little did Dana White and the UFC know that Ronda Rousey would go on to become one of the biggest stars in UFC history. Saying that women's MMA in the UFC was off to a good start would be an understatement. Rousey was blasted all over magazine covers, in movies, and it may sound ridiculous now in hindsight, but believe it or not, at one point people were debating if she was good enough to even beat Floyd Mayweather. And season 18 of The Ultimate Fighter was also a massive hit, with head coaches Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate being the first women to coach on The Ultimate Fighter, and also the first time women will fight as contestants on The Ultimate Fighter. And in season 20, with head coaches Anthony Pettis and Gilbert Melendez, the UFC will not only introduce a new strawweight division, but the winner of the season will become a UFC champion. Carla Esparza would go on to win this tournament fairly dominantly, but ultimately she would lose in dominant fashion in her very first title defense against an absolute monster in Joanna Jędrzejczyk. With Ronda Rousey's stardom and her ability to change a fight in an instant, and Joanna Jędrzejczyk's brutal, fan-friendly striking ability, UFC 193 in Melbourne, Australia quickly became the most attended event in UFC history at the time, with over 56,000 people in attendance, grossing a gate of $6.8 million. There's no doubt about it, the women were absolutely running the show and completely taking over the UFC. And on that night, one of the biggest upsets in MMA history happened, where Holly Holm shakeups the entire world.
Beautiful. Beautiful. She's hurt. She's in trouble. She's hurt. Holly looking to finish. Holly.
An insanely viral moment that would just boost women's MMA even further. Joanna would then go on to coach the 23rd season of The Ultimate Fighter, and the newly crowned bantamweight champion Holly Holm would go on to lose in another massive upset at UFC 196 against Miesha Tate. At this point, women's MMA took a small hit in terms of the casual fan base after superstar Ronda Rousey was defeated. However, enter a new superstar who will become the greatest women's MMA fighter of all time. Amanda Nunes dethrones Miesha Tate via rear naked choke, becomes the new women's bantamweight champion, which prompted the announcement of UFC 207, the comeback of Ronda Rousey. Ultimately, she will lose this bout in embarrassing fashion, but awarding the UFC with a $4.75 million gate. After this, for the most part, women's MMA seemed to die down immensely, but definitely not to the level that it is at today, with super fights like Amanda Nunes versus Chris Cyborg,
seeing that now it's real. Oh, she's hurt. She's still got her down. Cyborg nearly out on her feet. Oh, she did it. She did it. Cyborg out cold.
huge upsets like Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Rose Namajunas,
Against Jędrzejczyk.
Well, Rose... Oh! Another knockdown! Rose Namajunas trying to close the show!
She was doing a great job of feint.
That is it!
It's over.
Rose Namajunas! Rose!
and 2020 Fight of the Year Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk,
History.
Fights like these are what seems to have kept women's MMA alive. However, everything seemed to go left on the night of May 7, 2022 at UFC 274 when Rose Namajunas took on Carla Esparza for the second time, which can be explained as arguably one of the most boring fights in UFC history. And it seemed as if any possible rising star that had a swarm of fans hopping on the train early were instantly derailed. Fighters like Macy Barber and her grueling defeat to Roxanne Modafferi, Molly the Meatball after back-to-back spinning elbow knockout victories, ends up losing 2 in a row in the first round via submission, one of those losses being to rising contender Erin Blanchfield, who ultimately just lost in a very uneventful fight against Manon Fiorot, causing people to make statements like, "I feel bad for this crowd. You know these fighters are good when they can put you to sleep through a screen," claiming these fights are unbearable to watch. And the mountain of criticism goes on and on. The stock of women's MMA seems to be dropping quicker than Ben Askren's. So now that just leads the main question. Is the UFC gonna abandon women's MMA like they did Demetrius Johnson? Or are they just gonna look ahead and hope for better days in the future? Which fighter will rise up and become the next superstar of women's MMA? And will it happen anytime soon? Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. As always, I thank you all so much for the support, and I'll catch you in the next video.